"You need to start paying rent," my father demanded while my stepbrother would lounge across the whole house freely. I moved out. 10 years later he remembered me for, growing up, Max knew my place in the family. It wasn't that my father outright hated me, he just never looked at me the way he looked at my older brother, Jake. Jake was the golden child, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. If he failed a test, it was the teacher's fault. If he crashed his car, it was a bad road. If he lost a job, the boss must have been unfair, but me? I had to earn everything. I wasn't angry about it, not at first. It was just the way things were. I got used to making do with less. Less attention. Less praise. Less support. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, maybe one day Dad would see me the way he saw Jake. That hope died the day he asked me to start paying rent. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted after a long shift at the warehouse. I could still hear the sound of forklifts in my ears, the weight of heavy lifting aching in my muscles. I walked into the kitchen and found my father sitting at the table, arms crossed. "Sit down, Max," he said. Something about the way he said it put me on edge. Saturday, he cleared his throat, like he was about to say something very reasonable. "You've been working full-time for a while now," he began. I nodded, not sure where this was going. "It's time you started contributing to the household. From next month onward, I expect you to pay rent." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "Rent?" I repeated. He nodded. "You're earning now. It's only fair that you pitch in." I sat there, staring at him, trying to process what he was saying. I glanced toward the living room, where Jake was sprawled across the couch, feet up on the coffee table, watching TV. "What about him?" I asked, nodding toward my brother. Dad barely even turned his head. "Jake's different." Different. The word hit me harder than I expected. "What do you mean, different?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "He's going through a tough time," Dad said, as if that explained everything. "He just lost his job." "So?" I shot back. "I had to pay for my own gas money at 16. I had to buy my own clothes. I had to figure out my own college tuition." "You didn't cut Jake off when he needed money." Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'm not here to argue. This is my house, and if you want to keep living under my roof, you have to start paying your share." I stared at him, realizing something for the first time. I wasn't family to him. Not like Jake, I was just another mouth to feed. Another financial burden, and if that was how he saw me, then maybe it was time to stop playing along. That night, I packed my bags. I had no idea where I was going to go. No plan, no savings. Just a duffel bag of clothes and a burning determination that I would never let myself be treated like that again. As I walked past Jake on my way to the door, he barely looked up from the TV. "Good luck out there," he said lazily, smirking. "You're gonna need it." I didn't reply. I just walked out, and I swore I would never come back. If I thought leaving home would be the hardest part, I was dead wrong. The real struggle started the second I stepped outside. At first, I crashed at a friend's place. He had a tiny one-bedroom apartment that was already cramped, but he let me sleep on the floor next to a pile of laundry and an old gaming console. "You can stay for a few weeks," he said. "But after that, man, I can barely afford this place myself." I understood, so I started looking for a place of my own. What I could afford, though, wasn't much. I found a single room in a rundown boarding house on the other side of town. The walls were peeling, the heater barely worked, and the guy in the next room had a habit of yelling at his TV deep into the night. But it was mine. The first few months were brutal. I had been working at a warehouse, lifting boxes and stacking shelves for minimum wage. It was backbreaking work, and the paychecks barely covered rent, food, and gas. I learned how to stretch $1 like never before. Ramen became my best friend. I rationed gas like it was liquid gold, only driving when absolutely necessary. Some nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake, but then I remembered how my father had looked at me, not as a son, but as an obligation. I would rather starve than go back, so I pushed harder. I took extra shifts. Whenever they were available. If someone called in sick, I volunteered. If there was overtime, I took it. I started saving whatever I could, even if it was just a few dollars at a time. One night, after an especially grueling 14-hour shift, I sat in my freezing room, holding my paycheck in my hands. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt under my father's roof: pride. Leaving home was the hardest thing I had ever done. But surviving after that? That was brutal. For the first time in my life, I had no safety net. No home to return to if I failed. No father to lean on, not that he had ever supported me in the first place. If I didn't figure things out, I would end up on the street, so I worked, and I worked. I took every shift I could find, pushing my body to its limits. The warehouse job paid next to nothing, but I made sure I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. If someone called in sick, I was there. If they needed overtime, I was the first to raise my hand. At night, I collapsed onto my mattress on the floor of my tiny rented room, exhaustion weighing down on me. The heater barely worked, so I slept under layers of blankets. I ate ramen, canned soup, and dollar store bread because that was all I could afford, but even through the exhaustion, I kept telling myself one thing: this isn't forever, and it wasn't. After a year at the warehouse, I knew I needed to make a change. I had watched the managers, the supervisors. I saw how they operated, how they handled business. I wasn't just lifting boxes anymore, I was paying attention. When an opening for a team lead position came up, I applied. I was the youngest applicant, and everyone doubted me. But I had something they didn't: hunger. I got the job. The pay bump wasn't huge, but it was enough. Enough to finally move into a real apartment. Enough to start saving, even if it was just a little, and that little. It started adding up. For years, I had been stuck in survival mode, just trying to make ends meet. But now, I was thinking bigger. I wanted more than just stability, I wanted freedom, so I started planning. I took night classes, learning trade skills: construction, carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. I wanted to build something for myself. When I had saved enough, I made the leap. I quit my warehouse job and started working under a contractor. It was a risk. I went from a stable paycheck to unpredictable income. Some months were great, others were miserable, but I was learning. And then, one day, I got my first independent job, a small renovation project. Nothing huge, just a kitchen remodel. But when I finished, the client was so impressed that they told their friends. Then their neighbors. Word spread. The small jobs turned into bigger ones, and before I knew it, I had my own contracting business. It wasn't easy. I put in more hours than I had ever worked in my life. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, sleep, but when I bought my first house, not a rental, not a borrowed space, but my own home, I stood outside and looked at it for a long time. This was mine. I had built this life, and I had done it without my father, without Jake, without anyone handing me anything. For the first time, I felt something I had never felt under my father's roof: pride, and I thought that was the end of my old life. I thought I would never hear from him again. I was wrong. It was just another day. I had just gotten home from a job site, boots covered in dust, hands rough from the day's work. My business was doing well. Life was good. Then I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the man standing there, my father, but not the strong, proud man I remembered. He looked defeated, his shoulders hunched, his hair grayer than I remembered. He had lost weight, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been properly ironed in weeks. For a moment, neither of us spoke, then he sighed. "Max, we need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe. Arms crossed. "About what?" He hesitated, then finally admitted, "It's the house." I said nothing. "I'm about to lose it," he confessed. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, as if trying to regain some of his old authority. "The bank. I fell behind on the mortgage. I tried to fix things, but I cut him off." "Let me guess. Jake didn't help?" His face twitched. For years, Jake had been the one who could do no wrong. The one who was never asked to pay rent, never forced to carry any responsibility, and now, when things got tough, he was nowhere to be found. Dad didn't answer, he didn't have to. I let the silence stretch between us until he finally spoke again. "I know I wasn't fair to you," he said quietly. "I know I made mistakes. But Max, this is our family home. I can't lose it." I stared at him, his words ringing in my ears. Family home, the same home he had forced me to pay rent in while Jake lived there for free. The same home I had to leave because he made it clear I wasn't really family. He was only calling it our home now because he wanted something from me. I took a slow breath, then asked, "Where were you when I was struggling?" He flinched. "When I was sleeping on the floor of a friend's apartment." I continued, my voice like steel. "When I was barely making rent in a freezing room with rats in the walls. When I was working 14-hour shifts just to afford food." He looked down, shame written across his face. "You didn't care then," I said coldly. "So why should I care now?" "Because I'm your father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I almost laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "He hadn't been a father to me in a long time. You made it clear a long time ago that I was just a tenant to you," I said. "Now you expect me to be family?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, I saw my father not as the towering figure I had once feared, but as a broken man who had made his own choices. And now, he was paying for them. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, though I wasn't. "But you're on your own." His eyes widened. "Max, please," but I had already stepped back inside my house, the one I had built without him. I looked him in the eye one last time and said, "Good luck." Then I shut the door, and this time, I was the one who walked away. I thought that shutting the door would be the end of it, that after 10 years of silence, my father would take my answer for what it was and walk away, just as he had let me walk away all those years ago. But desperation makes people do pathetic things. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then another, and another. By the time I checked my voicemail, I had 5 messages, all from my father. His voice was different now. Gone was the stern authority, the cold, detached control he had always wielded. Instead, he sounded small. Defeated. "Max, please. Just hear me out. I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't desperate." Another message, "I know I wasn't fair to you. I know I treated Jake differently. But you're my son, Max, doesn't that count for something?" And another, "Max, I don't have anywhere else to turn. If I lose the house, I'll have nothing." Nothing. Funny. That was exactly what I had when I left. I didn't call him back. Instead, I got another call a few days later, from my aunt. "Max," she said, her voice tight, "I know you and your dad don't get along, but he's really struggling." I let out a dry laugh. "Oh, now the family cares." She sighed. "Look, I know he was hard on you, but it's not just him. If he loses the house, it's gone. Everything your grandparents built." I cut her off. "He made his choices. Now he has to live with them." There was a long silence before she said, "You really won't help?" "No," I said, and hung up. For years, I had been the forgotten son, the one who was treated like an outsider in his own family. And now, suddenly, I mattered, because they needed something. Because I had made something of myself. It wasn't long before I got a text from Jake. "Jake, dude, you're being a brat. Just help Dad out." I stared at my phone for a long moment before replying, "Me, why don't you help him?" His response came instantly, "Jake, I'm not in a position to." Of course he wasn't. He had spent his whole life coasting, never worrying about responsibility, never thinking about the future. He had been protected, coddled, while I had been shoved out into the cold to fend for myself, and now, he needed me. I didn't reply. A week later, there was another knock at my door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. This time, my father didn't try to play strong. He looked tired. Beaten down. The proud man who had once demanded respect now looked like someone who had been wrung dry. Max. He started, but I raised a hand. I already told you, I said. I'm not helping. His jaw tightened. This is our family home. I almost laughed. You made it clear a long time ago that it was your home. Not mine. His shoulders slumped. Max. I don't have anywhere else to go. And there it was. The truth, Jake wasn't helping him. The rest of the family wasn't either. He had burned every bridge, and now he was standing in front of me, the son he had cast aside, because I was his last hope. For a second, I felt something close to pity, then I remembered the way he had looked at me when he told me to start paying rent while Jake got to stay for free. The way he had let me struggle. The way he had never once asked if I was okay when I was barely surviving. I took a slow breath, meeting his eyes. I struggled, I said quietly. And you didn't care. You didn't lift a finger to help me. He looked away, but I made it, I continued. Without you. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in my life. I saw him for what he was, not the invincible figure of my childhood, not the strict, demanding man who had cast me out, just a man who had run out of options, a man paying the price for his choices. I took a step back and started closing the door. Max, wait, I didn't. I shut the door, and I didn't look back. A few months later, I heard through a cousin that the bank had taken the house. My father had moved into a rundown apartment somewhere on the outskirts of town. Jake had disappeared, probably onto someone else's couch, mooching off another person, and me, I was still standing, still thriving, because when life pushed me down, I got up. When they abandoned me, I built myself, and when they came crawling back, I let them fall. For once in my life, I wasn't the one suffering. For once in my life, I had one life, I had one